back to Never Tariffied, where we dive into international trade risks, how to deal with those risks in your commercial agreements, and what to do if things go wrong. I'm Tatiana Sainati, head of global disputes at Wiley, and joined by my co-host, Matt Lapin, special counsel in our international trade practice. This week, we're also excited to welcome a special guest, Jessica Horwitz, a partner at Bennett Jones in Ontario. Welcome, Jessica.
Thank you for having me.
Great to have you, Jessica. Over the next few weeks, we're going to be bouncing around the world, looking at some different types of international trade risks that are impacting global supply chains.
And we're particularly glad to have Jessica's insights on this episode because this time we're going to be looking at trade issues and specifically tariffs between the U.S. and Canada and how those have impacted business relations and supply chains. Now, in some ways, it's pretty surprising that we are in a situation where we can devote a full episode to Canada and the United States. When you work with global supply chains or deal in cross-border transactions, you can always anticipate a degree of risk. And some countries and regions come with a significantly greater degree of risk and uncertainty because of geopolitical tensions or political instability. But historically, Canada hasn't been a source of a lot of those concerns. We've enjoyed a pretty stable relationship, political and otherwise, with Canada over the decades. There's been a lot of trust between the countries historically. So, Matt, I'm curious, how would you describe U.S. Canada trade issues pre-2025?
I'll let Jessica give your perspective first.
Sure. Well, I mean, there's always issues, especially lawyers. We're very good at finding issues. There's things to talk about, but historically, no. It's been a very stable and longstanding economic and trading and geopolitical relationship between Canada and the U.S. for a very long time. Largest undefended land border in the world, heavily integrated supply chains dating back decades due to longstanding trade policy and cooperation treaties between the two countries. So, stemming back to the post-war era, the 1950s and the 1960s, we had the Auto Pact in 1965 that started the integration of the Canada-U.S. auto supply chains. So that's part of the explanation why it's so difficult to disentangle those supply chains on short notice right now.
Yes.
We've had long-standing defense and national security cooperation, both, fighting together in past wars. Canada is a member of NATO with the United States. Canada is a member of NORAD with the United States for joint northern defense. We're the country that has the longest standing ITAR exemption. And of course, we've had the Canada-U.S. free trade agreement since the late 80s, the NAFTA since the 90s. And so there really hasn't been very many tariffs between the two countries, and there has been less administrative burden with respect to trade between the two countries because of like a customs import data sharing arrangement. That means that there's no export declarations required when you're shipping things from Canada to the US and vice versa, because the customs authorities share import data with each other. So it's been very smooth, right? Very low friction, very easy. And that's why we have developed supply chains that are so integrated. We have companies that are sending products temporarily across the border for some further processing, and the products can cross the border multiple times before they're finished and go to an end customer. And those types of supply chains are obviously heavily dependent on the fact that there are no costs associated with crossing the border every time you cross. So what we've been seeing in the last 10 months or so has been extremely disruptive to those long-standing relationships, and part of the reason why Canada in particular has been shocked by the developments.
Okay, but Canadians are nice, Matt. So I'd expect Jessica to say, yeah, everything was hunky-dory. Is that the American perspective as well?
I mean, I think broadly that is. I think, the key point that I wanted to touch on that I'm glad you raised, which is going to definitely feature in our discussion here, is that integration. Because the fact that there has been this longstanding, relatively frictionless trade environment from both an export and an import perspective, U.S. and Canadian side, with a few exceptions. We know there are some sectoral areas where, just like every country, we have our, specific interests, whether it be steel or agriculture or others. But broadly,
softwood
lumber, the very first trade matter that I ever heard of before I even knew what, any trade matters were as a baby lawyer, that has been around forever. But despite those, those exceptions, because of this relatively frictionless environment, that's one of the interesting things is when you have this integrated supply chain, it does create different sorts of risks when suddenly that friction appears. And that's what I think what'll be interesting to now talk about is, okay, when you've gone from a relatively frictionless environment, a very integrated supply chain, which again, we can't say for every other relationship around the world, what happens then when you introduce these risks, these new frictions into that environment? And that's where I think, some of these questions we're not going to talk through, it's a very interesting discussion to have because it's sort of unique in many ways.
Okay, so we have an extremely stable and cordial, actually almost sounds like a deep friendship in terms of the historical relationship between the countries, but that's not where we are now. Jessica, I think the word you used was shocked. How has the relationship evolved in the past 10 months or so? Where are we now?
Well, maybe I can just start with some of the practicalities, and Jessica, obviously, your perspective as well. But what we've seen, obviously, is I think one of us had just said as we use the magic word tariffs, is that now where we were in a relatively tariff-free environment or very low tariff environment, that being a big element of friction, we are now in the era of tariffs. And many of those tariffs are ones that either did not previously even exist. For instance, the border tariffs that were applied against Mexico and Canada specifically. No other countries had these specific tariffs applied against them, with certain exceptions. We can talk about what that means practically. But that all of a sudden introduced this year, never had been even on the map before. So again, now you have a brand new friction that it never even existed. Adding on top of that targeted actions or at least statements that have been made by the administration about particular sectors, bringing this into now the realm of national security and talking about border security as now an element of tariff policy and trade policy, which was never really a piece of the U.S. Canada relationship. And then adding on to the fact that, as we'll touch on the end, there is now this ongoing USMCA, now the subsequent agreement from NAFTA. I guess we call it a renewal or review that is going to be going on. So all of that new friction adding into that process as well. This is a whole new environment for, I think, a lot of U.S. and Canadian companies that are operating internationally that is essentially bespoke for the last few months. Like this wasn't, none of these risks were ones that were really, from my perspective, at least from a lot of my clients, even on their radar as potential issues. And now they've been thrust, forefront. But I don't know, Jessica, what's your take on it?
I think that there was not an expectation that President Trump would go after Canada and Mexico first, right? Like, to your point, he was very clear about tariffs being a major part of his economic policy and his international policy. But you would have thought maybe the targets would be other trading partners that were more contentious relationships. So that was surprising. And I think it caught a lot of the Canadian economy a little bit off guard. There was, I think, some expectation that there might be some tariffs on some of the same higher sensitivity product categories that we saw in 2018, 2019, steel and aluminum. That wasn't as much of a surprise, but I do think that it's been surprising how long it's persisted. I think Canada maybe thought that we would be able to negotiate a resolution to it the way that we did in 2018, and that hasn't been the case. And so as opposed to focusing on trying to achieve a short-term resolution by negotiation or diplomacy, I think Canadian businesses are starting to pivot and starting to think about, okay, well, if these are going to be around for a while, how do we adapt to this new reality? And then being forced to make some strategic decisions to go forward with the business.
That'll be an interesting point to come back to again, is the changing supply chains, right? Because that obviously from the U.S. perspective, same. If companies need to look at the current environment and if the environment appears to be now baked in, at least at minimum, an uncertain tariff and trade environment, if not one that's going to have a lot more friction long term, right? We do certainly have a lot of businesses that are saying, okay, well, then we need to re-examine what our supply chains look like, potentially looking at new partners or even keeping similar partners, but on different terms, which I think, again, that will definitely feed into our discussion about, well, what do you do if that's the business decision you're going to make?
Well, exactly. How are companies going about that? I mean, Jessica, you spoke about deeply integrated supply chains, historically integrated supply chains. Now we've got tariffs on a lot of those goods. That's certainly increasing costs in unexpected ways. I'm sure there are other issues as well that companies are now having to think about that they didn't have to think about before when it comes to cross-border trade between Canada and the United States. So what are the biggest issues that you guys are seeing, and how are companies addressing those risks?
I'll let our guest chime in there first.
Sure. Well, I think the biggest risk is just the lack of certainty and the unknown, because businesses hate uncertainty. Businesses like predictability, reliability, clear-cut rules, because that allows businesses to make informed, strategic, long-term investment decisions and operational decisions. And when you don't know what the landscape and the circumstances are going to look like 24 hours from now, much less 6 months or several years from now, it's really challenging to plan. But I don't think that's a risk that businesses are unaware of. So that's really the challenge, it's how do you remain nimble? How do you diversify to insulate yourself from those shocks and from the vulnerability that comes with heavy integration and heavy dependence on just one supplier or just one customer or a very small group of them.
And that's one thing, I've touched on it before, and I'll come back to it. Thank you for teeing it up perfectly for me again, which is this question of diversification, because I certainly have plenty of clients who are in the space of, they may not be ready to move on from, obviously a very substantial market right next door. They're going to continue working, either on the customer facing side or as suppliers with their Canadian colleagues. Not going to go away, because for many times what we would see is we've had the same supplier for 30 years. We've had for one part, and they're the only ones that we use. We've only ever used them, and that's going to be our supply. Or our major customer. They're 60% of our business, and we really haven't spent a lot of time on diversifying our customer base for this one product line because we've got that customer. They're based in Canada, no issues, fine. Now we're not maybe in that environment where they are now looking at, okay, if we now need to start thinking more nimbly, what does that practically mean? What does it mean in terms of qualifying new suppliers, conducting due diligence on them, establishing terms on maybe a supply agreement that nobody's looked at for 30 years because it was kumbaya, and we had our supply agreement that had terms that were good in 1985 and they're fine now. Same thing on the customer side. So that's, I think, one of the risks that I think people aren't appreciating in terms of needing to think about is the inertia risk, as I call it, is that they've been able to have a certain amount of inertia in their risk management, whether that be in just kind of the relationship building they have with their suppliers or their customers, or in the actual, getting to the boring legal stuff for them, the contractual terms that they may be working under where they just haven't had to really think about it. And now they're being put into a position of having to now think about it and bring these things up to date for the current environment. So I think that's a risk they're not thinking about necessarily.
Yeah, absolutely. And from Canada's perspective, there has been a lot of complacency with respect to the dependence of our economy on the United States. Canada, we're a relatively small country. We are heavily dependent on exports to support our GDP. We're dependent on foreign direct investment for investment in large infrastructure projects. And 75% of our exports historically have gone to the United States. I saw a statistic that the trade with the United States supports 1 in 6 jobs in Canada, and it represents about 20% of Canada's GDP. So that's a huge impact on the economy if that relationship is threatened, as it is now. And we were comfortable with that dependence because we trusted the U.S., right? We had such a good track record of partnership that it really was not considered to be a very high risk, which obviously was not the right assumption to make. And so I think that if there is a silver lining in this period in history, it is showing Canadian businesses and Canadian policymakers that there is value in going beyond the low-hanging fruit of the huge, profitable, wealthy U.S. customer market and trying to actually grow the trade relationship with other partners. So just to give you an idea, U.S. about 75% of exports. The next largest export market, I believe, is China at about 4%. So, and then beyond that, it's just really diversified. A lot of trading partners with very small, less than 1% share of Canada's exports. So the U.S. is going to be difficult to replace, but it will be to the benefit of the Canadian economy to do that. But also with diversification. So to your point, Matt, about multiple suppliers, using one supplier that's highly specialized, using one customer that relies on you in the same way. With diversification is going to be a loss of efficiency. So there are going to be additional costs associated with that across supply chains, because the whole principle underpinning globalization is this idea of competitive advantage, the economic principle that if countries can specialize in producing the goods or the services that they are best suited to produce the most efficiently, and then they outsource the economic activities that they're less efficient at to other countries that are more efficient at it, you grow the pie for everybody. You grow the pie internationally, everybody becomes more efficient, everybody reduces costs, and you can create more economic wealth. And so if you pull back on that specialization, there is going to be some loss, right? There's going to be some additional costs and just reduced efficiency because you have to engage in more types of economic activities than maybe you did in the past. Or in the supplier context, you'll have to maintain relationships with multiple suppliers. And so maybe you're buying, only one container of goods from a particular supplier instead of 3. And then maybe you're paying a slightly higher cost to each supplier because you don't get the same bulk discounts that you were getting before because you had that huge volume that was concentrated. So adjusting to the cost benefit analysis to build in an accommodation for increased costs for decreased risks is going to be something that businesses will contend with. On inventory too. A lot of companies, especially in Canada, used just-in-time delivery models for sourcing materials and merchandise. When we need a shipment, we're running out of our supplies, let's just order it from our supplier in the United States right across the border in Michigan, and it'll be there the next day, right? You put it on a truck, it's there the next day. You don't have to hold inventory. You don't have the costs associated with having to stockpile a certain number of months of materials because you know that it's available. And in an environment where you can't rely on that certainty, the costs will go up as well.
Well, Matt, you alluded to this a little, and I think it gets to some of what you were saying earlier on, Jessica, about for a long time, this was just a stable relationship that you could depend on their efficiencies that go along with that. But there's also maybe a little bit of complacency that goes along with that too. And whether it's tariffs or we saw, several years ago, COVID, something that's outside of everyone's control, there are always going to be risks, and what are the best ways that we can manage those risks? I think some of them, again, Matt alluding to contract dispute resolution mechanisms in your contracts, like to what extent when you're either revisiting your existing relationships or looking at what are these new relationships going to be, to what extent can you create in those inter-party relationships stability that maybe is lacking or elusive right now, given everything that is changing in the global world order. And that's something that we'll get into in more detail in later episodes. But that leads me to another question for both of you, which is this the new normal? Is instability, or are we going to see things continue to change?
I mean, what is normal? But, who knows? But no, in all seriousness, I mean, I'll give my perspective. Love to hear Jessica's as well. My take on this and what I've been sort of preaching to clients is probably very similar to what you actually were just talking about, Jessica, is that to the extent that you had a period of time where things were extremely stable, we do appear to be entering a different era, and we have been creeping that way for a long time. Maybe we've just hit the accelerator on that right now, but we seem to have been creeping in this direction for some time of less stability, less sort of frictionless global interactions, whether they be on physical trade, digital trade, whatever it may be. We seem to be moving to a more fragmented environment. So with that in mind, then, if that's the, what people should be envisioning, that the past 30 or 40 years that maybe they set these relationships up with, the prior era and this new era of instability, there are just certain basic things that, again, may have been more common for, say, a really strange trade relationship they might have had with some small supplier in Vietnam or, Angola or wherever it may be for some specific item. We're like, well, that was very unique. And then we're going to take a higher risk approach. We're going to do some special things for that relationship. But everywhere else in the world, we're just going to kind of go about our business as we always had. We may be shifting now. So my advice is those things that you were doing in those one-off relationships that you thought were uniquely high risk for some reason, whether that be supply constraints or geopolitical risk or corruption risk or whatever it may be, start thinking about those and bringing those into your broader set of supply chain commercial agreements, whether supplier side or commercial side, because those were reflecting risk. And now that risk that you thought was just off on the margins may now be part of just your day-to-day business. So that's kind of how I've been, preaching to the client base. But I'm curious, what's been your take on that?
Well, expect the unexpected, I think, is the theme that everyone's taking away from this. After the pandemic, you started to see global pandemic sneak its way into force majeure clauses, boilerplate force majeure clauses in contracts. So whereas before it would have said act of God, natural disaster, war, global pandemic is...
And sanctions. You see sanctions in there now, too.
Or sanctions in there now that makes the performance of the contract impossible. That wasn't something that people really thought was likely before. And so suddenly now that's in there as boilerplate. And I think what we're going to start seeing is a boilerplate on tariffs and more intentional distribution of the risk, the financial risk associated with changes in tariffs, whether it's one party accepting with their eyes open the full brunt of that risk, or if it's some kind of a price adjustment clause where either the vendor pushes that increased cost back on its customer if there was some kind of material change in tariff rates or tax rates between the time of the purchase order being placed and the time of the delivery of the goods, or maybe it's a cost sharing arrangement where the vendor and the purchaser agree to split the cost or apportion it in some fair way, or rights of termination, that if it turns out that the sale is not going to be profitable after all because you have an extra 25% tariff that you have to pay on the product, do you have a right to terminate it, right? And navigating with both parties with their eyes open what those eventualities will look like. People actually opening up the Incoterms book and looking at what the Incoterms actually mean that they're agreeing to when they put a DDP or a FOB or a CIF in their purchase order. What does that actually mean?
For the true trade nerds listening to this podcast, you'll love that.
And for those who aren't, Incoterms are the shipping terms?
Yes, shipment terms globally agreed to, shipment terms that are generally agreed to by parties around the world that have certain meanings in terms of where risk of loss is borne, who pays for certain portions of the shipment process, who's responsible for clearance, all which are very relevant to trade risk related to tariffs potentially. And again, to the point of risk sharing, cost sharing, allocation. It's a point that for years people would just kind of see whatever we've used for the last 30 years, that's the Incoterm. It's fine. We're not going to worry about it. And now we're actually seeing many more clients, and to the extent they're not, they should be inquiring and having real discussions both with their commercial parties or with their counsel about, okay, what should we be using? What makes sense given where we're at in terms of our trade relationship, given the risk and the uncertainty? So I think that's a perfect example of something to take another look at.
And just awareness of the fact that Incoterms are not simply a specification of where the goods are delivered, because that's a commonly held misperception, is that if I say FOB, it just means you're going to pick it up at my port of export or at my factory. But it's more than that, right? It's, as you said, it's the apportionment of risk. It's who has to buy insurance for the goods at various different legs. It's who has to pay the customs duties on the import, who has to manage those clearances. So it's a whole suite of terms that is incorporated by reference into the sale agreement. And I think it's a good thing that companies are paying more attention to the specifics of what that means, because it goes to the going into a contract with your eyes open and knowing what you're agreeing to.
Well, so it sounds like change may be the new normal, but that there are some ways to address the risks that come with uncertainty, or at least to appraise those risks with eyes wide open and figure out how you want to deal with them. What about rewards? Are you guys seeing any opportunities in all of this flux?
Well, I think Jessica mentioned silver lining. Obviously, there's challenges that businesses are facing right now that aren't going to go away. And that's, I think, going to be a consistent theme of uncertainty and having to change your business model. But in some ways, it's facilitated some interesting discussions, which I think they're hard discussions in some cases, particularly for companies that have been, as you say, very kind of static or, been not very, I would say, creative necessarily in evaluating their supply chains and or their customer base. But it has driven, I think we've seen a lot of companies, rather than simply abandon, international supply chains, really just thinking more critically about their business there and maybe being a bit better about targeting where they want to work, where they don't want to work, diversification across their supply chains. So not necessarily moving away from operating internationally, which I think was one of the fears that many of us had when we kind of were moving into this uncertain market. Like, does this just mean that the walls go up and nobody's trading with anybody anymore? I don't think that's what we're going to see. It's certainly not what I'm seeing. What I'm seeing is more thoughtful and, quite honestly, heartening for myself as a trade nerd, is to see is like the elevation of supply chain professionals, the elevation of trade professionals, the elevation of people who may have always had a little bit of a say in the business world, but now have been really put front and center as people who really do understand the way this works on the ground day to day, moving things, tens of thousands of miles around the world, and having that and the knowledge of those people be front and center in terms of business relationships. I think that's actually really a positive that I hope is retained even if we move out of a cycle of current uncertainty. So that's my silver lining and opportunity that I see.
You're preaching to the choir, Matt, because you and I are both compliance counsel that have been proselytizing to our clients for years about the importance of reviewing your tariff classification, reviewing your origin, make sure your declarations of origin or your certifications of origin are actually consistent with the rules of origin that apply to that product. Suddenly, members of the C-suite know what the terms tariff classification and rules of origin mean, which might not have been the case last year. So the fact that companies are more receptive to the importance of trade compliance and understand the importance of investing in that area as opposed to treating it as an afterthought, I absolutely would agree with you. In Canada, I would also say that towards the diversification initiative, which generally I agree with you is hopefully a silver lining, although we don't want to diversify too much because you run into that inefficiency issue that I mentioned before. But we are seeing political will in Canada to invest in some major infrastructure projects that are really long overdue that will help Canada to diversify and to get its products to other markets. So things like new oil and gas pipelines, new ports, marine ports, just better transportation infrastructure. These are really important things that have been constraints to Canada's ability to profitably and efficiently export the goods that it has to places other than the United States, because the U.S. is right there. The U.S. is the only country that we can deliver to over land. The rest is marine or air. And, so there's different complications associated with that. So developing out that infrastructure that makes those things easier, I think will be helpful in the long term. And you're absolutely right that the walls are not going to go up, because the reality is that very few countries in the world have everything that they need domestically. Canada might be actually one of the best positioned ones because we do have a lot of what the world wants domestically. You can't just have a, Castle United States or Castle Canada in isolation. And so it's really about, from a trade policy perspective, how the politicians are going to navigate the different sensitivities and come to an agreement that's at least sustainable, if not one that makes everybody perfectly happy. And then for businesses, how do we just navigate this new playing field responsibly, balancing compliance and due diligence with efficiency and cost reduction?
Well, so it sounds like a shakeup in a historically steady relationship did send some shockwaves, but is leading to greater sophistication in approaches to supply chains and diligence, and hopefully to greater resilience for businesses specifically, individually, but also maybe for markets overall. And that's thanks in part to the expert guidance and advice of professionals like both of you to your clients.
Excellent plug there. Appreciate that.
Very subtle, right?
Well done.
So thank you all for joining us, and we hope you'll listen in again next month when we'll have another special guest to understand the risks and rewards of changing trade dynamics from an EU perspective. And Jessica, thank you so much again for joining us.
Yeah,
it was great fun. Thank you. Despite what's going on, I still consider us to be friends.
Same.
Yep. Even with the World Series loss, but it'll all be fine. Sorry, Dodgers.
We're still hurting a little bit over that, so too soon.
I don't sports.
It's probably for the best. Thanks again, Jessica. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay.